Well, let's move on to our next process. It's called Create WBS. The work breakdown structure, known as the WBS, is a hierarchical depiction of the project. It looks very similar to a family tree or other tree structure type document. On the screen, you've got an example of a work breakdown structure for writing a book. You can see it's broken down from the topmost level into lower levels. The lowest level of the work breakdown structure is a rather important term to remember. It's called a work package. Now, if you take a look at what is being done, we're breaking down the book, project management and introduction, into pieces of work that are required to get this book published. First of all, we've got writing the book, and then you can see 1.1.2, editing the book, and lastly, publishing the book. So you could break down the work in that way. On most projects, you could break down work in a variety of ways. So what is a work breakdown structure? As I said, it's a hierarchical decomposition of work to be executed on the project by the project team. One of the big things about the WBS is it helps you discover what you haven't previously discussed with the team. It helps you flesh out the project and, as it were, discover how everything is woven together. It's a really great tool. It defines the scope of the project and it subdivides the work into smaller, more manageable pieces. What do we mean by more manageable? Easier to track, easier to estimate than it just being some idea in one's head. It puts it into a visual, it puts it into a graphic that one can actually relate to when you begin to think about time and cost and scope. Each descending level of the work breakdown structure contains greater level of detail. So the lower you go, the more detailed you're getting. The lowest level of the WBS is called a work package. It's the smallest WBS component. Here's an example of building a house, a WBS for building a house. And as you can see in this next slide, level 1 is always the name of the project. In this case, house building project. For the sake of this illustration, we're going to assume that we've done all the designs. We're not going to show that in this WBS. We're not going to show permits or materials or inspection. So the next level is things such as concrete, framing, plumbing, electrical, interior, and roofing. You see, and then a level under that has more detail. So under concrete, you've got pour foundation, install patio, stairway, and under framing you can see what comes next. So that's really the idea. It's not meant to be a schedule. It's not meant to be in order of how things happen. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. You could break down work by phase. You could say, okay, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, or you could just go, by maybe what you would do first and what you would do next, but it does not have to be in that fashion. I find out that when I'm working on work breakdown structures with teams, they typically think what comes first, what comes next, but it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, if you're working on a new technology project, how do you know what comes first and next? You might have an idea, but you don't have to think rigidly because the WBS is not the schedule. In fact, some teams think about anything that needs to be done on a project. They take post-it notes, write it on post-its, stick it on the wall, and then they begin to assemble those components bit by bit after. So that's the work breakdown structure. Let's take a look at the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs of this process. So our mission is to hierarchically break down the work and to create a WBS. So the first input here is the project management plan. Don't forget, it contains the scope management plan, and the scope management plan contains guidelines for developing a WBS. The next one here is project documents. Now, as part of project documents, we have something called a project scope statement. Remember that? We talked about that in defined scope. Well, the project scope statement becomes a sub-input to create WBS. Remember, it has inclusions, exclusions, so it's got a firm handle regarding what is in the project, and it's all described in great detail, so that's an input here. We also have requirements documentation, which describe how requirements map back to the business objective of the firm. Why is this requirement needed on the project? The next one here is enterprise environmental factors, EEFs. Any factors that could impede or influence this process needs to be considered. And we also have OPAs, organizational process assets. These could be templates, work breakdown structure examples from previous projects, and so on. We have two tools and techniques here. First one, expert judgment, a no-brainer. Of course, you need to be an expert. If you're breaking down work, you don't just do it at random. You need to know what you're doing. Okay, so that's expert judgment from the team, from stakeholders. And then the next tool and technique is decomposition. This involves decomposing higher levels in the WBS to lower levels. That's really what this is all about, breaking down the work into smaller chunks. Let's take a look at the outputs. Scope baseline. Do I hear you say, what's that? Well, the scope baseline is a collection of three very important documents. So we've talked about the project scope statement. It is part of the scope baseline. We've talked about the work breakdown structure, WBS. Well, it is part of the scope baseline. And that's why WBS is not explicitly mentioned in the outputs, because the scope baseline contains it. In addition to this, we have a document called a work breakdown structure dictionary. Now, the work breakdown structure dictionary breaks down what exactly each WBS element is. It defines for you, element 1.2 is this, or this is what element 3.5 is all about. So the same way you would go to a dictionary to understand words, it's the same way you would go to a WBS dictionary to understand the WBS components. The next output here is project document updates, and we're talking about things such as the assumptions log, because that may need to be updated after this process, and also requirements documentation. If there are any requirements updates, those should be reflected in requirements documentation. Okay? I'm going to go a few steps back just to show you a few things. So when you take a look at this image here, this numbering system, 1, 1.1, 1.2, and so on, that has a name. And this is the code of accounts. The numbering system for the WBS is called the code of accounts. Okay? The topmost level of the WBS, level 1, is known as the root node. Now, as we go deeper into this course, you'll find out that there are a lot of definitions that you will need sufficient time to understand. I would like you to check up two more definitions. One is called control account. You do need to know this in great detail before your exam. And the other is planning package. These relate to the work breakdown structure, but we're not going to talk about them now. I would like you to make a note. Read up code of accounts, read up planning package, read up work package, and also read up control account. These will likely help you as you study for the exam. And that concludes our review of Create WBS.